Even at age 2, I remind parents, we cannot actually force our children to eat anything they don't want to eat. We have to become their partner in this equation. And if you don't believe me, try to force feed a 2-year-old. It won't go well. So there is an actual division of responsibility. And the way we talk about it in my house is that me as the parent, my responsibility is to make sure that there's always enough nutrient-dense food that nourishes their body available and that they can eat it when they are hungry. Their responsibility, even from a young age, actually is to listen to their bodies and to not eat when they're not hungry and to eat when they're hungry. So even if at a mealtime, a child's actually being picky and that is their actual maybe underlying motivation, but their words are that they're not hungry, I will honor their decision to not eat that food, even if the words they're saying it that they're not hungry, realize that they're not going to perish from simply not eating one meal that they didn't want to eat.
If you haven't done so already, go ahead and click that subscribe button down below. It's a little red button. You punch that, and it's going to notify you every time we put out a new episode that can help you improve your bone health. And then also, if you haven't done so already, head over to BoneCoach.com, sign up for the free 7-day Osteoporosis Kickstart. That's going to walk you through everything you need to be doing right now to get on the path to improvement and stronger bones. After you do those 2 things, go ahead and press play on this episode, and I'll see you inside. Welcome to this episode of the Bone Coach Show. Joining us today to explore raising strong, healthy, resilient kids and grandkids is wellness mama, Katie Wells. Katie Wells, the founder and CEO of wellnessmama.com and Wellnesse.com. A mom of 6 with a background in journalism, she took health into her own hands and started researching to find answers to her health struggles. Her research turned into a blog and podcast, and she's now written over 2,000 blog posts, 3 books, and was named one of the 100 most influential people in health and wellness. When she's not reading medical journals, creating new recipes, or recording podcasts, you can find her somewhere outside in the sun with her kids or undertaking some DIY remodeling projects. Some fun facts about Katie: that she is a doula, speed reader, hates bananas, loves baseball, is a scuba diver. She's also INTJ, highly experienced in answering the question, why? And it is an absolute pleasure to have you here, Katie. Great to see you again.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited for our conversation.
Me too. And we're talking about a really important topic, which is our kids, the future generations, and raising them strong and healthy to be resilient. And there's a lot that goes into that. And I want to make sure I know you have some great thoughts on this, and I can't wait to tap into that. But I would love to start with how you got started and sharing the journey behind Wellness Mama. What inspired you to start it? And then how does that serve as a resource for parents and grandparents seeking natural health solutions for those children?
Absolutely. And it actually ties in perfectly to raising healthier kids, because the origin was dual journey at once. One of was when I had my first child, it was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. I didn't know it at the time, but it was sort of what cascaded me into what the medical world would term autoimmune disease, which took me years to actually find out, get a diagnosis, and then eventually reverse. But in 2006, I was starting to experience these symptoms, and I had just had my first child. And actually sitting in the doctor's office at the 6-week follow-up from having him, I was waiting for the doctor who was running late and reading through anything I could read in the waiting room while I was nursing my baby. And while holding him, I read in, I think it was Time magazine, there was an article describing a study that had just come out that said, for the first time in 2 centuries, the current generation of American children will have a shorter life expectancy than their parents. And I still get chills when I hear those words, but the strike contrast of looking at this perfect newborn baby and reading about what they expected for his generation to face in the rise of across the board, all chronic diseases, which we're seeing play out, certainly, it's resolved in that moment that I didn't want that for my child, and I didn't want that for anyone's child. And I didn't know how, but I resolved that day that I wanted to be part of helping to shift that statistic or to change those numbers for the sake of our kids. And so those journeys lined up. When I wasn't getting answers from the medical world, I turned to my research background and started kind of viewing myself as an N of 1 and looking at the things I had within my ability to affect change in, and what could I change that might change the outcomes. And that led to a whole deep dive into a lot of different areas of medicine and science, but more importantly into self-experimentation, and eventually kind of firmly anchored me in what I find is one of my first principles I say often on my podcast, which is at the end of the day, we are each our own primary healthcare provider, and we can work with amazing practitioners, and that can be an incredible tool in our toolkit. But we are the ones making those small cumulative decisions that compound and result in health outcomes. And that's true, of course, in the mindset world and the financial world. Compounding is one of the wonders of the world. So that's something I say often now, and has become an important part of my journey, is to help people step into the driver's seat of their own health and to realize how much we actually do have the ability to affect change in that realm. And in doing so, model that for our kids and hopefully start to shift those numbers for future generations.
So powerful. And I agree. We are the CEO of our own health. You should be the most educated, empowered advocate for you. Because as much as I care about you, as much as Katie cares about you, nobody's going to care about your health more than you do. So you should not have a driver-passenger relationship with your doctor where you're putting all your faith in them. You don't know where you're headed. You should be the one helping steer that vehicle too. So let's talk about raising strong, healthy, resilient kids. And let's maybe start with some core principles behind that. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what are some fundamental principles you believe are essential for raising strong, healthy, resilient kids. And for those who are grandparents that are listening also, maybe they're a little bit more removed, but maybe they're still active in those children's lives. Maybe you could talk about how they can contribute to reinforcing those principles as well.
Absolutely. I love this question. And the great thing is I think that the first principles that apply in the parenting world in general are actually the most helpful when it comes to helping our kids have a solid foundation for health and raising them with that level of resilience and physical health. And to me, when we take those all down to a first principles level, what is left are things like curiosity and agency or autonomy, the pattern recognition and the ability to connect dots, and then sort of building from there with secondary skills. And this is actually the core of my parenting approach outside of health and nutrition as well, is really running everything through the filter of those sort of first principles of parenting and asking whether any decision is going to help enhance or potentially harm that. And so as an example, we can look at the education world. I actually created a curriculum from the ground up when my oldest was 5, because I tried to ask the question, what best prepares him for a potentially uncertain adult future, which is also applicable in the health world as well. And I realized that none of the existing options I felt like adequately did that, because we want our kids to, for instance, think outside the box, but we put them in a literal box of a classroom and tell them there's one right answer to each problem on the test and that failure is getting a wrong answer. But that certainly isn't how adult life often plays out, and certainly not how entrepreneurship works at all. And so when I took it down to first principles, I realized if we ask better questions, we might perhaps take a whole different approach to how we educate our children. And I realized that actually very much applies in the health and nutrition world as well. And I think most parents and grandparents as well would be familiar with the well-studied idea that what we model is much more effective in actually passing things on to our children than what we tell them. And I think there's the phrase of, kids will do a really bad job of listening to you, but a wonderful job of becoming you. And so I think that also speaks to our own primary healthcare, our own agent driver seat relationship with ourselves. And to the degree that we can model that, we give them permission to do the same. And I think the balance of that is also respecting, even from a very young age, their autonomy and their ability to make agent decisions about their own body when it comes to nutrition, even if it's not necessarily always what we would choose for them. So I, with my kids, keep the idea in mind that they are each, from the moment I get them, an infinite autonomous being. They are not some adult who's in the process of loading, who's a partial person. They already are infinitely autonomous. And so trying, though I do it imperfectly, certainly at times, to honor that autonomy within them and to give them the pieces of information and help them find and learn the pieces of information that let them make empowered choices. I think often it's easy to underestimate, especially with young kids, just how powerful and how capable they are of making great choices when they're given the puzzle pieces to understand why I want to make those choices. And when I get questions like, how do you make your kids eat this way? My answer is that I don't, because I found 6 out of 6 when they are given education, when that's part of our family culture, when they understand early on how certain foods can benefit their body or other certain foods might make them not feel great, I find that almost always they surprise me with the choices they make because it's their choice. And then that's their foundation. It's not something that I'm holding emotional responsibility for. It's simply something that I'm a partner in walking that journey with them and helping them learn to make those choices from a young age. And we hear a lot about rising generations and skills they lack when they enter adulthood and how they're sort of having trouble entering the world. And I think this is potentially part of the antidote to that, is honoring from a young age and really reinforcing their ability to make wonderful choices and letting them fail sometimes. Because even as adults, we certainly do as well. I certainly don't eat 100% perfect diet every single day. So why would I expect that of them?
Hey, it's Bone Coach Kevin Ellis. I want to take one more minute to talk about if you are somebody who was newly diagnosed with osteopenia or osteoporosis, and you're at a point where you're stressed, you're worried, you're overwhelmed, you have no idea where to start or how to get started getting confident in your plan. I want to tell you about the Stronger Bone Solution Program. Over 5,000 people have come through the Stronger Bone Solution Program, and it walks you through the exact process you need to fill in the missing pieces, uncover critical things in your plan that you may not be aware of, and help you make modifications, adjustments, and tweaks to get you to the place where you're building stronger bones. I want you to get confident in your plan so that you can focus on living life and enjoying the life that you deserve with the people you love most. So if that's where you want to be, head over to bonecoach.com/apply and apply for our Stronger Bone Solution Program right now. I'm Bone Coach Kevin Ellis. I want to see you inside this program. I want to help you get on the path to improvement and stronger bones. Hope to see you inside very soon. Let's get back to the episode. Yeah, there are two things in there that, so much of that was great, but there were two things that really stood out to me: the modeling and how important that is to really set the example. You lead by example, show your kids. I was working out this morning and my daughter was sitting on the couch and she was watching me. Sometimes she'll actually get up and do it with me, but I know that's going to be something in the future that she looks back on and says, well, my dad was active, and this is just kind of what we do. We wake up, we be active, and we go for a walk every morning. So we're modeling those behaviors from a really young age. And also with giving autonomy to kids and helping them make decisions, but also letting them fail. Obviously, not when they're putting themselves in risk or a risky situation, but letting them fail, I think, is so important. There's a guy named Andy Grammer who sings some really wholesome music, great songs, but he has a song called I Wish You Pain. And the song is about letting them make the mistakes and go down that path so they can learn and become the best versions of themselves. And I think that's just a beautiful thing. So let's talk about nutrition, because if we're talking about modeling and we're talking about nutrition, I think it's really important. Can we discuss some of the important nutrition pieces in early childhood for building stronger bones, for improving overall health? And what are some of those key nutrients that parents and grandparents should be focused on? And maybe how can we help them incorporate that into their plan?
Yeah, great question. And again, I think this is an area where modeling is extremely key. I think educating them as well, but I think they pay so much attention, especially in those toddler years. They're literally wired to pay attention to what we're doing all the time. So I actually think the most powerful thing we could do for them in those phases of life is to make sure we're nourishing ourselves well, and then talk about it passively in conversation. And certainly that curve changes with teenagers. I feel like as kids become teenagers, anything you overtly push, they might actually resist actively, whereas those subtle modeling behaviors actually are the ones they might pick up on and start to integrate. An example of that would be, I've never told any of my kids that they need to go out in the morning sunlight and watch the sunrise and get light in their eyes, even though that's well studied to be beneficial for health. But it's something I do every morning. And now my teenagers, I find, will sometimes even be up before I am, sitting on the front porch in the sunshine, getting light on their eyes. And so I think the modeling is the common key of all of that. And then I think it's worth understanding sort of the division of responsibility when it comes to nutrition, because even at age 2, I remind parents, we cannot actually force our children to eat anything they don't want to eat. We have to become their partner in this equation. And if you don't believe me, try to force feed a 2-year-old. It won't go well. So there is an actual division of responsibility. And the way we talk about it in my house is that me as the parent, my responsibility is to make sure that there's always enough nutrient-dense food that nourishes their body available and that they can eat it when they are hungry. Their responsibility, even from a young age, actually is to listen to their bodies and to not eat when they're not hungry and to eat when they're hungry. So even if at a mealtime, a child's actually being picky, and that is their actual maybe underlying motivation, but their words are that they're not hungry, I will honor their decision to not eat that food, even if the words they're saying it that they're not hungry, realize that they're not going to perish from simply not eating one meal that they didn't want to eat. and make sure that they have nutrient dense food available at other times. But it is actually their responsibility and their choice whether they eat or not. And so I don't ever try to coerce or bribe or in any way force them into eating, because I really want them to be able to stay and pay attention to their hunger cues and to what their body's actually wanting. I feel like that was, for me, through years of chronic dieting and unhealthy relationship with food, I actually had to relearn that skill in my 30s. So to me, it's very important to help them stay in tune with what their bodies want, which I feel like babies come into the world with a very strong sense of. I mean, their hunger cues are imminent and they make them very well known. And I feel like perhaps we lose that when we try to put kids on a schedule or force them to eat only certain foods, or, create a power dynamic in their relationship with foods. I think that's sort of a little bit of the psychology around it. Beyond that, I think it's helpful for parents to take an approach of, instead of thinking about, with kids especially, things like calories or macros or categories of food related to that. If you want to think about one thing, think of the nutrient density of the food and try to just any category maximize the availability of nutrients in whatever food you're preparing. And if certainly there's some specifics within that, like we know kids have a decently high protein need related to their body weight because they're building so much skeletal muscle. And of course, I'm sure you speak to their bone and everything being formed in that age. But there's also a tremendous micronutrient need. And this is something we're seeing more in the literature right now, is the decline of micronutrient density in the American diet as a whole. And this is why we now see supplementation in a lot of adults, partially is that the nutrient quality of our food has declined, but I think still worth really analyzing and trying to choose foods with high micronutrient availability. So that would be things like proteins and animal products, but also things like fermented foods, which have a different array of micronutrients, and things that like pre and post biotics that feed gut bacteria, as well as things like healthy fats. When kids' brains are in their rapid growth phases, they have a really intense need for the right kinds of healthy fats. And this is one of the few categories where I actually talk about overtly avoiding things, because I think the overconsumption of seed oils and polyunsaturated fats we are now seeing can have a negative effect on brain health, and also on muscle development, bone development, skin health, and so much more. And get those simple switches in the house can make a huge difference. I also find when you let kids stay in tune with their natural hunger cues and try to make sure they have an availability of enough of what their bodies are actually craving. For me right now, with a house full of teenagers who are athletes, that means an insane amount of protein consumed in our house per day. And it means I am cooking a lot of protein all the time for them, but I want them to be able to listen to their bodies and to make sure that they're nourishing well. And I think there's a whole world beyond that as they get older that is optional, but potentially helpful if you want to really delve into their nutrient levels, their genetics, and additional ways that you can support. But I think those like core dietary things will get you 80% of the way there.
Yeah. And the right choices, they're not at the time of eating. That actually starts with the planning too, right? When you're before you even get to the grocery store, what are the things that you're learning? I mean, you're sitting here listening to a podcast right now, but what are the things that you're learning? How are you educating yourself so you can make those better decisions, so you can prepare better meals, so that when it comes time to eat or present those things to your child to have as part of a meal, that you already have that, everything is already built into that decision. So what goes on the fork and in the mouth starts way upstream with the education. And we also have, I make sure there's always an availability of certain foods if they truly are hungry between meals that they know are always pre-game to eat. And that's like things like fruits and vegetables, protein sources like beef sticks or pre-cooked chicken or fish or whatever it may be. And they have unlimited ability to eat those things if they're truly hungry any time of day. A little bit of a practical tip. There's an awesome app called Real Plans that lets you meal plan ahead of time based on how much of different, you can even put macros in there or how much of things you want to cook. And it can take into account what you already have in your house or leftovers. So it helps a lot with food waste and also making use of all the things you have in your pantry. I love that. Yeah. And you mentioned protein multiple times. So this is something that I'm a big proponent of. Your bones are 50% protein by volume. When you're building that skeletal structure from 0 to 18, 90% of that bone mass is being put on. You're trying to build muscle. You have to have protein to do that. So you need to make sure, a lot of times, I know it's easy and convenient to get some of these packaged foods that are very carbohydrate rich and carb heavy, but the kids and adults really need that protein throughout the day. So I love your suggestion of having something in the pantry where they know it's easily and readily available. We do the exact same thing. We have little beef sticks or turkey sticks or something like that, whatever they like. They know how to access it. They can get it on their own without asking. We also have like a bowl of organic berries or something too that they can grab from. So those are some really great suggestions. Thank you for sharing that. And one other note that I would make there is I always try to encourage curiosity too with the kids and trying new things. So not necessarily that the trying of something new is being forced on them, but just to approach it with curiosity and just see, do you like it? Do you not like it? What was the texture? What did it taste like? And asking those kinds of questions to build some ability to expand the palate and the foods that they're putting into their mouths. So let's talk.
And in that sense, early exposure also helps a lot. Like if as babies, they were given exposure to a wide range of flavors and to things like my kids were all given sardines when they were pretty young, and they'll still eat them now because it was introduced to their palate early. I think there's also the element of not framing certain foods as kid friendly and assuming that they're only going to like bland food and chicken nuggets. You might be surprised that even at 8 months old, they love olives and sardines and fermented stuff. And then you can build from there. But I think they also have the ability to, of course, develop that taste as they get older. And so in my house, even if they say they don't like something, I'll often say like, oh, okay, it makes sense. You don't like it yet. It's kind of a grown up flavor. And then they're a little bit like, oh. And so it's like, oh, as I get bigger, that's like an adult food. I might like it.
I tried sardines with our daughter when she was growing up. She ate them when she was younger. She won't eat them now, but she ate them when she was younger. But we have an air fryer. It's a glass air fryer. And we bought, I know a lot of times people get organic chicken nuggets or gluten-free chicken nuggets or whatever. And I was like, how can we make a better swap here? So we went and got really thinly sliced chicken. We put it in the air fryer, put a little olive oil on it, a little sea salt. And my son loved it. Absolutely loved it. And it was so easy to make too. So look for those ways that you can make better, healthier swaps. So let's talk about healthy habits too. What do you have any strategies for instilling healthy habits in kids from a young age? And how can we make that a fun thing too, and just part of the everyday life?
Absolutely. I think partially like we shape our environment, but our environment also shapes us. And so to the degree that we can create an environment that's naturally going to be beneficial to the habits we're trying to create, that takes a lot of the work out of it. So one area where I will even budget prioritize and spend time really optimizing is everybody's bedroom environment. Because we know, I would say, 800 episodes of my podcast, I'm yet to have one single expert say sleep is not important. And this is even more true for kids. So a lot of kids aren't getting enough sleep or enough quality sleep. And there are some pretty easy levers we can pull as far as having, if needed, blackout curtains, making sure that it's a dark environment, getting the temperature optimized, and even just creating a bedtime routine around that, trying to end meals. Like our thing is we end meals and screens by sunset because to try to keep our circadian alignment, and just creating that as a habit within the house. Same thing with the morning sunlight, like I talked about. Like when they were babies, I just took them outside with me for morning sunlight. And now they've sort of all integrated that habit on their own. One thing I do in my house that I think is a little bit unconventional, but realizing how important movement is for humans and how much less movement we're getting on average as humans than we used to, I tried to think, how can I set up my home to be as movement friendly as possible? And I'm certainly not as good as someone like Katie Bowman in this category, who has gotten rid of her couches and her tables, and they sit on the floor and they have climbing walls, I think, in their house. It's incredible. But I tried to take some ideas from that. And so we have a climbing hangboard in our kitchen, literally prominently featured in our kitchen. The kids all have gymnastics rings in their room. There's a gymnastics wall in our hallway. There's a gymnastics mat down the hallway that they can do flips on. And then there's a ton of outdoor stuff like slackline and trapeze and all that they can do as well. But I feel like kids inherently move through their environment in great ways. And so the more opportunities we give them to move through their environment in unique ways, even if it's a simple pull-up bar in the doorway, they're likely to jump up there and at least hang on it as they're walking through because they're curious about their environment. But I found it's fun as we've sort of built an indoor playground in our house, there's constant movement. And I also long ago realized I'm just going to have to repaint the whole house when the kids are grown, and I'm not trying to protect any of this furniture. So they will routinely box jump onto tables or the tops of couches or whatever, or do handstands against the wall. And I'm all for that because I figure walls can be painted, but skeletal muscle and bone density really developed well in childhood. So I want to optimize for that and paint the walls later.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we have in our house, we've got a rebounder that the kids can get on and jump on at any point in time. So a little mini trampoline. We do have the pull-up bar. So they'll see me do a set and they'll be like, okay, it's my turn. And they'll get up there and I'll have to spot them a little bit. Or we'll open up the floor and we'll play soccer. We'll move around a little bit and not break things. But I love that you have gymnastic rings in your, I don't have those, but that's definitely an idea for the future, because my daughter is in gymnastics now and she loves the cartwheels. And for anybody listening, gymnastics is really great. If you've got kids or grandkids and you can make it work from a budget perspective to get them into one of those classes, gymnasts have some of the best bone density out there, because you're moving your body and your bones in these short, sharp, dynamic movements. There's plenty of impact, and that's helping build good, strong microarchitecture in the bone. So that's a fantastic thing to be incorporating when kids are really young.
Well, and for us, it's an obscure thing, but a lot of mine are pole vaulters. And so the rings are also helpful to them in learning the swing upward on the pole. And so I'll find them often upside down in their rooms doing drills of getting inverted and keeping their hands away from their body, so they're not depending on their body to balance themselves, and like balancing and core stabilizing. And it's fun. These are all things in hindsight I wish I could go back and tell my 5-year-old self, because I didn't get those things as a kid. And it's so fun to watch them get to have those experiences.
Yeah, I love that. Now, you and I we were having dinner in Austin a couple months ago. And during our conversation, we were talking about our kids, and then we were talking about boundaries. And I remember I was just taking notes in my phone. And I was like, the next time I talk to her, especially on the podcast, I'm going to ask her a question about boundaries. So how should parents and grandparents approach setting boundaries with children? And how might these boundaries shift as children grow into teenagers and adults? And I have, even beyond that, is there an example of a boundary that's particularly important for maintaining respect and understanding within the family too?
Yeah, I love this question. And definitely this is an area I feel like I could talk for days. I feel like one of the things I think I said in that conversation is sort of that I believe that boundaries and kindness not only can exist together, they must exist together. And I think even in a parent-child relationship, I try to ask questions around the idea that parents are automatically owed a certain level of interaction of their kids that we categorize as respect, simply because we are the parents, without giving the same back to them. Like if a parent says, well, my kid told me no. And I'm like, well, how many times have we told them no? And is this inherently actually a lack of respect? Or perhaps is it triggering something in you that maybe was also an unmet need as a child that you can address within yourself in order to have a closer relationship with your child? But I think the sliding scale that you are talking about from our conversation is, I feel like as toddlers and in early life, they're learning the entirety of their environment. They're learning language. They're learning the way in which they interact with the world. And part of their signaling of safety in that environment is a little bit of structure, because they're trying to learn sort of like, where are the edges of my limits? Where are the boundaries with which I exist in time and space? And so in that sense, things like a little bit more structure can actually be helpful to them in a psychological sense as they learn to go through the world. But it's a sliding scale. And I feel like when you get to the teenage side, you're now on the entire other end of that. And they're wired to be moving toward autonomy. They're psychologically moving to a place of autonomy in their lives. So they're wired to push back against boundaries. And so at that point, if we're giving them unnecessary boundaries, we're simply creating opportunities, artificial walls that they can push against. And they're psychologically designed to do that. It's not unhealthy. It's actually a very healthy psychological sign for a teenager to want to push against boundaries. It's in both cases helping them learn to navigate that. So for toddlers, I feel like it's actually like giving them the structure they need to feel safe while encouraging them to ask the question why. I know it's exhausting as a parent to get the question why over and over, but that again speaks to that curiosity and that critical thinking that we really want to preserve and help them hone really well before they get to those teenage years when they are wired to push against boundaries, so that perhaps they come in with a little bit more discernment about why they're pushing boundaries and choosing those battles carefully, as also we hopefully do as parents. And the way I've seen this play out in practicality with my kids is when they're little, they do, of course, have more things like structured bedtime. And I give them more boundaries for safety within their world. And the obvious example of I don't let them run in the street, that's a boundary. But also explaining and educating behind that, and also realizing they would likely make the same choice if given the right framework and understanding to do it. Like I don't know of even a 3-year-old that would choose to run out in the street and put themselves in danger. So understanding why do they want to do that? How can I put the boundary in place when needed? And at the same time, teach them to want to make the choice that's going to be better for them in the long run as well. But I think with teenagers, it's really truly navigating as much as possible, respecting their autonomy and their agency while giving them just the simple barriers needed to keep them truly actually safe, not what we perceive as safe. And so that would be things like Their clothing choices, for instance, not a matter of life and death or safety within the world in most cases. And that's a form of self-expression for teenagers. And I understand entirely from the parent side, wanting our kids to look presentable and wear certain things in public, but they're moving to an age of autonomy. And how do we empower them and sit down and not argue with every clothing choice or food choice or choice of friends or choice of activities, still keeping them safe, but realizing they're wired to push back. And so as much as possible, trying to, from early on, hand that decision-making off to them so they have many opportunities to practice throughout childhood. The stakes are lower so that by the time they are truly on their own, they've well honed that skill. They've learned from failure. They've learned from bad experiences and hopefully have a better framework from which to make decisions in the world. And my oldest is not 18 yet, he almost is, but with him, I've seen this. He's my first one that I've done this all the way through. And even though he's not 18, recently actually sort of handed off the reins of his life entirely to him and let him know that, like, in my eyes, you are a fully capable adult human. And even though you are still living in my house and even though you are legally not 18, I just want you to know that I view you as fully autonomous. There will be no external boundaries that come from me. And I'm always here and I'm always in your corner if you need me for something or if you want advice or you want to talk something through, but just know that I view you as an adult. And so I've actually handed that off to him.
And what a healthy dialogue to have with, and how was that received by your son?
It's funny because I was given the opposite as a teenager. I had very restrictive rules and was often told I couldn't do things or not to do things, or given like pretty harsh judgment about what I wore, what I ate, any of those things. And so I felt an intense need to push back about that. Like even I tell kind of a funny story, but it was very true of like, I couldn't get my ears pierced till I was 16. And then I wasn't allowed to get a second piercing because my mom didn't like earrings. And so at 18, I got literally dozens of piercings. And in hindsight, I'm looking back going, those hurt. They weren't fun. I couldn't sleep on the left side of my body for like 6 months. There was no actual benefit to me in doing that. I simply wanted to because I couldn't. And so doing the complete opposite with my kids, I have found they actually they don't have the same desire I did to push back against those things and have, for the most part, made great food choices. As far as I know, they've never been out like drinking at Tractor Supply at 3 a.m. like I was. Like they just made good choices because they didn't have a boundary to push back against. And so he accepted that and he like thanked me for handing it off, but was also kind of like, that doesn't actually change my day to day. Like I feel restricted by you at all to begin with. And I don't feel a need to go do anything in an adult sense that I'm not already able to do. And he's actually much more open in conversation as well. So everything's a dialogue versus when I was in that sort of teenage rebellious stage, I wanted to push back against things. And I also just didn't tell my parents lots of things if I thought going to get judgment back from them.
You know, what comes up for me is these two words, be careful. And that almost to me is a boundary that if we can overuse with kids, because I think they need to be able to explore and expand and not be in this container that we try to put them in all the time and not think that there's only going to be a negative result if I pursue things a little bit further. Any thoughts on that?
I am so glad you brought that up. I love that. The things I've tried to not ever say, and I don't think I ever have to my kids, are be careful or because I said so, because I feel like those are actually not giving them the best information from which to make a decision. That's just, in the case of be careful, giving them sort of like the world could be scary, view it as such mentality. And so what I've often said instead of that, if they're like, and this happens, like they're climbing a tree or they're walking the top of the swing set like a balance beam or trying to do a cartwheel on it, is instead of being like, be careful, which is also more likely to make them fall, I'll try to say, oh, what's your plan? And then that way they're like, I'm wanting to encourage them to think like, oh, do I have a plan? But I'm asking them, not telling them. And so now the responsibility is on them to figure out if they have a plan or not. But they're the ones who are going to be responsible for the choices of those actions. And in most cases, obviously not like a life-threatening situation, but if it's that they fell off from a few feet up and maybe they got hurt a little bit, that's actually a great vestibular and limbic learning opportunity. And your nervous system's going to learn a lot of data from that experience. And I do feel like, especially when they're little and they're meant to sort of like fall off of things that are not very high off the ground or trip 1,000 times while they're learning how to walk, they're learning from that. And if we remove those opportunities for learning, they're potentially going to still need those lessons, but at a higher stakes environment when they're older.
Yeah. And what a great question. What's your plan? I ask our kids, what would you do like in X situation to get them thinking too about that and have that process take place. So let's talk about, because we do have most of the people in our audience, they may be mothers, they may be parents, they may be grandparents. I would love to talk about how you see the role of grandparents evolving in the family dynamic and as children grow. And then also, what advice do you have for them for helping maintain strong, supportive relationships between the children, the parents, and the grandparents? Because I know sometimes when you're the grandparent and you see your child doing something that you think should be done a certain way, or maybe a parenting approach that should be taken that they're not following. How do you have those conversations in a really healthy way?
This is such a good question, and certainly nuanced. I think there's several different things to think about. Like, we know, for instance, that there are actually studies that show that grandparents that are in their proximity to their grandkids and grandkids who are in proximity to grandparents both actually have better mental health markers and physical health markers in the case of the grandparents. There seems to be an element of they do, in fact, keep you young a little bit. I know that's not possible for every family. For me, I'm very fortunate. My parents live very close by, and they get to see my kids a lot, and there's a lot of interaction there. I'm not at that phase yet, so I can only imagine how difficult it will be as a grandparent when your child is now parenting their child in a way that kind of gives you pause. My hope is that in that situation, I will not, in the same way that I parent, not try to externally exert force on that situation or to give advice even when it's not asked, but hopefully to have enough of an open dialogue that those conversations naturally happen. It would seem like there's some in psychology about how when parents are parenting their own children for the first time, they can be confronted with a lot of the inner child stuff that happened when they were children. So there's like layers of an onion happening there. The good thing is, psychologists will say it's very possible for parents to spoil children. It doesn't seem to be possible in the same way for grandparents to spoil children. So I think anytime grandparents can have that really friendly, awesome relationship with grandkids, it's psychologically healthy to both parties. I know we also hear a lot about like grandparents sometimes being the ones that are like feeding the grandkids sugar, or parents getting frustrated with that. I guess that's not
first thing that popped into my mind.
Yeah. And my grandma was certainly that way. She didn't even have a vegetable drawer in her fridge. She had a candy drawer. But thankfully, my parents are not like that. And I would guess most of the listeners listening, if they're grandparents, are probably not in that category as well. But I would say finding out if the parents are choosing healthy habits or trying to reinforce elements of family culture that are positive, maybe asking them ways that you can be supportive, or sort of mirroring that if the grandkids are at your house, having the availability of high protein snacks and having the availability of things they can do to play, and becoming sort of a partner in that process, or another place where the grandkids get to experience that. And I think even though grandparents aren't operating in a parental role with kids, they are still in a role where kids look up to them. And there's obviously a deep relationship there. And so I think those are also amazing places for those educational conversations in like a non-judgmental way, but about whether it's the nutrients in food and how cool they are and how they benefit your body, or anything about health that's important to the grandparents. You can easily work those into conversation. And because the grandkids probably look up to you already, that's an awesome opportunity and another voice outside of just their parents who is giving them that insight. So I think grandparents essentially have a superpower there, because there's often such a strong relationship with grandkids and grandparents, and they look up to you and your wisdom so much that if you can make those things something you're also modeling and that you're also creating opportunities for, and that you're having fun conversations around, it is likely to stick in the kid's head a little bit more.
And you could easily, just to use the beef jerky thing as an example that we were talking about earlier, let's say instead of the candy, you have something like the beef jerky or a snack stick or something like that that's a healthier option that you may not already be in the child's house. You could introduce that and say, hey, Tommy really enjoyed this, and I got you an extra box if you want to take home. And that could be the way that's introduced into the household as well. So probably a more subtle approach to that. I want to talk about, you have not just Wellnesse Mama. So you created this amazing platform where you've done all this writing, this research, you've supported parents and grandparents through natural health solutions for a long period of time. And then from that, I know you also created another brand called Wellnesse with natural oral healthcare products. Can you talk about Wellnesse a little bit?
Absolutely. So 15 years ago, when I started delving into the natural health world and trying to figure out how to reverse the issues that I had, there were not the availability of a lot of the natural health stuff that we have now. I mean, I even remember buying grass-fed beef from an Amish farmer in a parking lot that I think was technically illegal in the state we were living in at the time because it wasn't licensed or certified or something. So things have come a long way. And now, thankfully, there are amazing products in most stores, and we can at least have an availability of healthier food choices in a lot of areas. But what I realized about 5 years ago was that I had friends who were really working hard to make sure they were eating organic, and they were avoiding a lot of the big things you wouldn't want to consume in food. But a lot of them were still using conventional personal care products. And it was because they worked. And they wanted to avoid the things they didn't want in their bodies, but they weren't willing to sacrifice how they looked, how their hair looked, how their teeth looked, whatever it may be, for just making the more natural choice. And I realized in order for them to have an option, it had to work as well or better than the conventional alternatives, ideally while not having any of those negative ingredients that they'd want to avoid. And I realize this is especially important when we're talking about families, because women on average encounter over 500 chemicals through personal care products a day, much more than men just because of the number of products used. And when a mom is pregnant, those things enter your own bloodstream within 26 seconds, and a number of those also cross into the placenta. And so we're seeing babies now born with hundreds of chemicals, identifiable chemicals in their cord blood. And those are just the ones that can cross the placenta. So the toxic chemical burden that babies are even born with today is so drastically higher than it was even just a few decades ago. And so I wanted to sort of take an 80-20 approach and realize, for families, where is the majority of that exposure coming from? And what are some easy ways that we could just simply reduce that exposure with easy swaps? And that's why I really honed in on the oral category first, and then also hair care, because for most families, those are the products most often consistently used that are the sources of the most exposure to chemicals you wouldn't necessarily want to have on your skin or your baby's skin. And also, for many years, I was making my own toothpaste strictly because I had a thyroid issue. That was Hashimoto's, was what I used to have. And fluoride is contraindicated when you have thyroid issues because of potential issues there. And so I was making my own toothpaste at home, and I published the recipes. They're still on my site, but I realized most people are not going to want to order 18 ingredients and make this very specific toothpaste. But if I could make it and make it available and make it work as well as conventional alternatives without the bad stuff, people would make the swap. And so that was really my driving force in creating Wellnesse. It's just moms don't have the bandwidth to make toothpaste every 2 weeks with 18 ingredients. How can I make this an easier journey? And in doing so, sort of 80-20 this toxin situation when it comes to exposure in kids, especially.
Now, you didn't know this, but I have Wellnesse toothpaste in my bathroom and in my kids' bathroom. I didn't tell you that before, but I have it there and I've used it for a long time. Can you talk about what's in the toothpaste and like, how did you come up with the specific ingredients for that too?
Absolutely. I'll try not to get too nerdy, but oral health is one of my pet research topics. And I became so fascinated with this when I read Nutrition and Physical Degeneration years ago by Dr. Weston A. Price, who was looking at not just the teeth and the occurrence of cavities in native populations, but actually even their jaw structure, and how things like their diet and their lifestyle factors related to oral health were resulting in an entirely different formation of the jaw, and that a lot of these native populations didn't need braces, they didn't get cavities, they weren't having these issues. And he started asking the question, why? And so there is a whole world of what goes into your body as far as the right balance of fat-soluble vitamins and not too much phytic acid, and creating an optimal environment in your saliva to remineralize teeth. But what I learned in that was teeth actually have the capacity to remineralize. And we're not often told that in conventional dentistry, but there's a constant dance happening in the mouth between the minerals in saliva, fat-soluble vitamins within the body, and the remineralization of the outer coating of the teeth. And I learned this firsthand while I was pregnant. I had 3 small cavities when I went to the dentist for a cleaning, and I didn't want to fill them while I was pregnant. So I decided to wait till after the baby was born, and we moved during that time. So I went to a new dentist thinking, oh, I need to get these cavities filled. And he was like, you don't have any cavities. And I was like, what? Because you're not told they can reverse. And so I started really researching that and realizing the teeth can remineralize. And there's a natural compound called hydroxyapatite that actually outperforms fluoride in a lot of clinical studies that related to this, but it's what's naturally occurring in the body that you use to create the enamel on your teeth. And it's also, like many things, we're not getting nearly as much in our human diets as we used to, but it's something that can be beneficial topically on the teeth as well. So that was one of the core ingredients I put in the toothpaste. I also definitely encourage people to look into the internal side of what's there. But then the other side of this is the oral microbiome. most people are familiar with the gut microbiome, and thankfully we understand a lot more about it than we used to. We talk a lot about it, and we know ways to support our gut microbiome. But our oral microbiome is actually like the first exposure of food to our microbiome in general, and it's intricately connected to our skin microbiome and our gut microbiome. And I feel like it gets a lot less attention than other bacterial environments within the body. If anybody's ever had a heart issue and then needed dental work, they might have been familiar with this because they'll often recommend antibiotics in that case to make sure that the bacteria in the mouth aren't going to cause a problem somewhere else in the body. But our oral microbiome is really connected to the entire body. And when we see oral health issues, it's an imbalance in one of two categories typically, but they don't occur together. So often you will not at the same time have strep mutans, which is the bacteria that causes cavities, at the same time as you would have a bacterial strain that causes something like gingivitis. Those are sort of like different types of dysbiosis in the mouth. And I realized a lot of conventional oral care products sort of take the same approach as antibiotics in the gut, where they just wipe out the oral microbiome entirely and sort of kill everything across the board, especially things like mouthwash, which we also now know can decrease nitric oxide production in the body because of that pathway. But when we're taking out all of our oral microbiome, we're also killing the beneficial bacteria. So just like in our guts, we have beneficial bacteria in our mouth. And in an ideal situation, those are perfectly capable of keeping the more opportunistic bacteria in check. And so I realized rather than wiping out bacteria, which we know we don't want to do in our gut, why are we doing that in our mouths? And how instead could we support the right oral microbiome, support our good bacteria, and give it a chance to keep the opportunistic ones at bay? And so that's where the other ingredients like aloe and neem and green tea come into play, because those are helpful in supporting the beneficial balance of bacteria in the mouth.
Hey, it's Bone Coach Kevin Ellis. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of the Bone Coach Show. If you're finding it helpful, please leave a positive rating and review. Hit that like button, subscribe to the podcast or the channel. That lets us help more people and reach and serve more people. And it also lets us know that this is helpful to you on your journey to better health and stronger bones. And then also, right down in the show notes, you can actually find a link to my free Bone Healthy Recipes Guide. That's going to give you access to some amazing and delicious recipes to support your journey to stronger bones. And then also, we have a link to my free Stronger Bones Masterclass in the show notes too. And that is the 3-step process that has helped people in over 1,500 cities around the world get confident in their plan for stronger bones. Over 110,000 people have taken part in this, and it's been really, really helpful for them. And I want you to have free access to it too. So add your name and email right down there in the show notes, get access to that free Stronger Bones Masterclass, and let's get you confident in your Stronger Bones plan today. Now, no fluoride really goes against conventional wisdom. Right. If someone goes into their dentist, their standard dentist office, and the toothpaste is going to have fluoride, they're getting a fluoride treatment. They're told you got to use fluoride in your toothpaste. What are the downsides of fluoride?
So it works in a similar mechanism or binds to similar receptors as something like iodine. So there can be a downstream effect on the thyroid, and it can slow or block the uptake of iodine in the natural pathway in the way it's supposed to happen. So there is a potential connection there with thyroid issues. It also, in studies, hydroxyapatite can actually outperform fluoride as far as the effects in the mouth that you're trying to have, as far as keeping teeth not just strong, but not strong and brittle. Fluoride can often sometimes make teeth more brittle, which you want to avoid. What's really interesting to me is they started adding fluoride to the water in many places, and fluoride, if anything, only, and I would argue very mildly or marginally, has a positive effect on teeth. But internally, it is not helpful in the same way as actually the topical application, if anything, that would be beneficial. So I always compare it to putting it in our drinking water would be similar to having a cut and eating Band-Aids. Like, it's just not going to effectively address the problem in the right way. And since there is another alternative that's natural and mimics the body's natural remineralization pathway and gives it literally the building block it would use to remineralize our teeth, I feel like it's an easy swap in. You can reduce your risk category because fluoride, at the very least, comes with a risk profile. That's why we have poison control warnings on most toothpaste.
Well, I want everybody to have access to this amazing natural toothpaste that you've created and the oral care products. So we're going to link to some links in the show notes where they can get access to the Wellnesse toothpaste. And there, you got a charcoal toothpaste, you got a whitening toothpaste, I believe, and some other stuff there. So check that out. That's going to be in the show notes. And before we tell everybody where they can find you, I know we only got a couple minutes left here, but I just want to tap into, are there any particular topics or things that you're passionate about that you just want to share? And then we'll maybe leave with or close out with any final message that you want to share with our audience.
Absolutely. And any of the things we talked about, I have articles on them on my site if people want to go deeper on any of those topics. I think the area I would say that might be like also the thing I would leave people with and that kind of ties it all together. We didn't go super deep on the mindset side of it, but I also think one of the biggest factors in health, really, truly, even on the physiological side, is our mindset and how we think about it and how we talk internally to ourselves and then as an extension to our children about things like health. And I think if we are using language that's centered around fear or avoiding or bad or danger, that's going to have a much different effect on the body than if we're making those choices from a place, an empowered place of positive choice. And I think that conversation first starts internally. And as an example of that, when I was recovering from Hashimoto's and still very much in the thick of it, I used to have internal dialogue that was things like, why can't I lose weight? Why can't I get better? Why is this so hard? And my subconscious did exactly what it's meant to do and answered those questions. Like, oh, because you have thyroid issues. Oh, because you had 6 kids. Oh, because motherhood is hard. And when I learned to ask better questions, I started getting much better answers. And I started changing my mindset, and then my body mirrored what was already changing internally. And so I think if we can learn to be very careful with our language and to also by extension model that and teach that to our kids, I think they come from a much more empowered place as well.
Love that. Katie, where can people find you?
Everything's at wellnessmama.com. You can find the products as well, the podcast, and all the blog posts.
Fantastic. And we'll link to all that stuff in the show notes. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation. I always like chatting with you, but this was especially close to my heart because I've got young kids that we're raising right now. And this stuff is all very important to me. And I'm sure for those listening, they were able to take a lot out of this too. So thank you so much for your knowledge and expertise. Thank you so much for having me. It's always a joy to get to catch up with you. Well, for everybody listening, you can find all the resources, show notes, everything mentioned here today over at bonecoach.com, and we will link to that in the show notes. I want to thank you again so much for your time. We'll see you in the next episode. Hey, it's Bone Coach Kevin Ellis. Hope you found that episode helpful and that you enjoyed it. Just one last reminder, if you haven't done so already, head over to bonecoach.com, sign up for your free 7-day osteoporosis kickstart. It's going to tell you everything you need to do to start getting on the path to improvement. Hope you found this helpful. I'm your Bone Coach Kevin Ellis. I'll see you soon.